The Boxborn Wraith. Written by Kevin David Anderson. Performed here by Jason Hill.
Not like this, Chow, Benny pleaded. Just shoot me, please! Chow shook his head. You know I can't, Ben. The boss was very specific. Now get in the goddamn box. Benny gazed down at the 6-foot-long wooded crate at the bottom of the shallow grave. It looked to be hurried work. Imperfect corners, protruding nails. Chow's men weren't carpenters. They were killers. And this box, with all its imperfections, buried in the middle of an old graveyard, was Benny's coffin. He knew it was pointless to beg, but Benny didn't know what else to do. Please, Chow, not alive. Don't bury me alive. Jump down there, you skimming bastard, or I'm gonna blow your kneecaps off. Chow aimed his gun at Benny's legs. If you don't panic, you got about 24 hours of air. You really want to spend that time in agony? Benny considered for a second, but before he decided, one of Chow's men pushed him in. He landed on his feet and stood up fast, the top of the grave coming to his chest. Benny's heart pounded, and even in the cool October night, his black hair was matted with sweat. Chow knelt down. You know, the boss owns this old boneyard. Bought it a year back when the last vacancy filled. He thought it'd be a nice place to bury the trash, Benny. You'll be the first. Benny looked out at the gravestones jutting up from a thin layer of fog. Orange moonlight shimmered off 100 forgotten epitaphs. The only earthborn sources of light came from the porches outside the cemetery. Jack-o'-lanterns burned brightly in the surrounding neighborhood. And as Benny was about to start begging again, he caught a glint of movement in the distance. Chow saw it too, and Benny felt the muzzle of the revolver pressed up to his jaw. Go ahead, Ben. Call out. Benny gazed at the trick-or-treaters skipping along the sidewalk outside the cemetery, a small group of parents close in tow. Make one sound and I'll blow your mouth clean off. Then I'll have to go kill some kids. You don't want to go down like that, Ben. And I ain't in no mood to kill kids. Benny opened his mouth. Chow leaned closer. Then, maybe, when that is done, I go pay a little visit to your house, Benny boy. Say hello to that nice wife and kid of yours. Where is he tonight, Ben? Out trick-or-treating? Benny grabbed Chow's collar. You stay away from my family, you son of a bitch! Chow pointed the gun into Benny's grave. Get in the box, and they'll be fine. Benny knew far too well that Chow didn't make threats. He made promises. The sadistic pig would have no problem abusing his family while Benny slowly suffocated. Sighing, Benny let his hands fall to his side, gazed down at the place where he was meant to die. It was cold, hard, dark. That a boy. Now lie down and let's get this done. Benny lowered himself down and the darkness swept over him like a blanket. Chow, let me have a light. Chow kicked some dirt into the grave, landing on Benny's chest. Won't change nothing. I don't want to die in the dark. Chow pulled a flashlight from his back pocket and tossed it down. We all die in the dark, Benny. Fumbling with the flashlight, Benny pulled it to his chest as Chow's men threw down the lid. One of them jumped in the hole to hammer in the nails. Benny placed his hands on the lid as it was slid into place. Then he lifted his head and peered through the cracks. Chow stood, holstered his gun, and turned to go. Hey, Chow, Benny called. Yeah? Benny clenched his teeth. If I ever see you again... Chow smiled. You won't. Benny closed his eyes as the first nail was put in place. He managed to make it through the hammering okay, staying calm, retreating into thoughts of his wife and son. But when the dirt started to fall in loud clumps, Benny started to lose control. His body shook, and he started pounding, then clawing at the lid. Wooded shards broke loose and stabbed the tender skin under his nails. Blood ran down his fingers as the sound of falling dirt became distant, replaced by the creaking of wood making up his coffin. He placed his hands flat on the lid, realizing that it was bowing inward from the weight of the dirt. For some reason, he started to laugh, thinking that the lid might implode and crush him. But after a few still moments, Benny realized he wasn't going to be that lucky. The smell of earth, sweat, and freshly cut wood filled his nostrils as he tried to take slow breaths. With no place to go, the sounds of his breathing bounce around the box like a trapped bat, amplifying his panic, feeding his dread. Benny tried to occupy his mind and not think about his itching neck or his aching legs. He desperately wanted to bend his knees, just for a few seconds, and the fact that he couldn't was maddening. He pounded the lid with his fists and screamed, then heard the faint sounds of someone sobbing. And as he pressed his forehead at the top of the box, he realized the sobbing was his. His echoing cries continued for 20 minutes. Then, energy spent, he passed out. He awoke with a jolt, trying to sit up, and smacked his head on the unforgiving wood. An instant reminder that the nightmare of being buried alive hadn't been a nightmare at all. He moved the light so he could see his watch. Just past midnight. He'd been buried for 4 hours. 20 hours to go, he thought. I can do this. I can do this. Just make it through the next 20 hours without losing my mind. And... A distant sound seized his attention. Benny held his breath, straining to hear it again. He pressed his ear to the lid, and there it was again. A faint, digging sound. Someone was digging. I'm in... He tried to call out, but his previous screams had strained his voice. It had to be Chow digging him up, Benny thought. Maybe the boss just wanted to teach him a lesson. Seemed a bit extreme, but the digging got closer. Or maybe it was teenagers out on a dare, digging up a fresh grave. Yeah, that might be it. It's the kind of Halloween stunt he'd have pulled as a kid. Right? Benny pounded on the lid again. Here! I'm in here! But even before the echo of his voice had faded, he noticed something very, very wrong with the sound of the dirt being moved. It was getting closer, more hurried, and it seemed only a few feet away. But the closer it got, the more wrong it seemed. It wasn't until Benny turned his head and pressed an ear at the bottom of the box that he realized what it was. The digging wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below. Oh, Jesus, Benny cried, gripping the flashlight, shining its beam around the box. He could feel dirt fall away beneath him, the bottom of the box sagging downward, hanging over a black hole in the earth. Something scraped on the bottom and Benny jumped. He squirmed, trying to roll to his side, but before he could, something clawed its way down the length of the coffin. Benny froze, taking a deep breath. He turned his head to the side, aiming the light into the widest seam in the box. The beam bounced off a dirt wall a few feet away, and he saw deep claw marks in its surface. He could hear movement outside, accompanying his panicked breathing, but every time he chased it down with his flashlight, there was nothing. Then, like earthworms caressing his skin, he felt warm air on the back of his neck. Something very close exhaled. Pulse pounding, he whirled around, eyes wide. He was terrified to see something from outside glaring in. Large, white eyes with thick eyelids of pale skin blinked, and then narrowed curiously. Benny kicked the box. Get away! He reared for another kick, but a dozen clawed hands burst through the box, seized every limb, then pulled him, screaming, downwards. His head slammed hard into the dirt as bits of wood rained down around him. He blinked a few minutes and got his focus, instantly wishing he hadn't. A dozen golf ball-sized eyes set inside hideous faces surrounded him. Before Benny took a breath, he felt clawed hands grab his shirt. The creature pulled Benny's face in close, sniffing him through a pair of slits below its wide eyes. It then howled angrily and pushed Benny away. Some of the other creatures moved away in revulsion. Some looked angry, and one just stared, astonished. Sitting up, Benny took a good look at his captors. Their long arms allowed them simian-like movements, reaching forward on worn knuckles and swinging their legs underneath. If it wasn't for their long, noseless faces and the bald skin that hung off them like sharp haze, Benny would have thought them hairless chimps. A few of the creatures wore clothes, not for function, more for decoration. Benny cringed in horror, recognizing several popular tattoo patterns on their garments, realizing their clothes were fashioned entirely of human skin. Benny felt a push on the back toward a torchlit corridor, and as the small group started to move, he had to stay crouched in the 4-foot-high passage, which was perfect for the size of its inhabitants. Stumbling around the descending tunnel, Benny was prodded from behind, with a blow every few minutes. He could hear them talking in a language he'd never heard before, but the tone was unquestionably angry. Suddenly, he emerged into an enormous gymnasium-sized chamber. Coffins stacked up like bleachers lined the walls. The seats were filled with females of the species and hordes of their brood. As he walked past, the smaller eyes of the young ones glazed over with hunger, staring at him, disappointment flashing over all their gaunt faces. The scene reminded Benny of pictures of starving children, bloated stomachs, ripe with malnutrition. A tall, thin female wearing human teeth around her neck like a pearl necklace emerged from behind a pile of discarded jewelry, watches, and gold fillings. She walked towards Benny, holding a staff constructed of bone. The others cleared a path, and Benny tried to stand up straight. She tapped his chest with the staff, then placed a hand over his heart. Benny felt it beat faster at her touch. She shook her head, then turned to her people and spoke in their strange language. They didn't like what she had to say. Commotion exploded around the room. Some yelled with rage, some sobbed. The one that had grabbed him earlier pushed to the front and started yelling. He held a broken female like a dagger, thrust it up and down. The female jabbed her staff into the dirt defiantly. The larger male took a step back with a slight bow, but then roared savagely and lunged at Benny. Benny brought his hands up as the creature landed on his chest. Swinging a fist, Benny connected with the side of its bald head. It fell back, howling like some enraged beast, then came again, this time with teeth bared. Benny heard a crunch and screamed as it bit into his wrist. Feeling the teeth touching bone, he knew he had only seconds before he lost his hand. He pulled with all his strength, wildly thrashing and kicking at his attacker, but the creature suddenly let go. It stumbled back, gagging. Benny's blood splattered on its face. It gasped for air, grabbed its throat, then fell to the dirt floor. Its tiny legs twitched, and then it lay still, dead. Before Benny could check his wound, the female pulled him up, dragged him to the rear of the chamber and through an opening. Crouching, Benny whirled around and saw her wave the bone staff at the doorway. In an instant, the opening to the room vanished, replaced by a wall of dirt. Thinking it safe for a moment, Benny examined his wrist. To his astonishment, he wasn't even bleeding. The cuts were deep, but there was no pain. It's like he was looking at a wound on someone else's body. The female moved past him, and Benny gazed around the room, noticing the familiarity of his new surroundings in an instant. It had a high cathedral ceiling, pews made entirely of coffins, and a podium of mud and bone. Beyond that was an altar, decorated with elaborate hieroglyphs. The creatures were depicted here carrying coffins, worshipping them, and feasting on their contents. Life, the female said. The boxes are life. Benny's head was spinning. He started to understand. A word floated around in his mind, for a few moments seemingly searching for some sane place to land. When sanity seemed unavailable, they finally just said it. Ghouls. Boxes empty. So long, she said, her speech labored as if struggling for every syllable. Then, you. You eat the dead to live, Benny said, more to himself than to his savior. Remembering what happened to the one that had just bit him, he knew why they couldn't consume him alive. Living blood was poisonous. But why don't you just kill me and eat me after? He said. I mean, you're ghouls, right? She thrust the staff past the altar toward a mud statue of a female, arms spread wide, reaching for the surface. No, her mother forbids it. Must not make dead, no kill, forbidden. Mother forbids, Benny repeated. Well, don't that beat all? The ghouls got religion. He looked into her huge eyes as an idea erupted in his mind. You know, I think you and I can work this out. Benny pointed up. You send me up there, and I'll fill your boxes for you. Man, oh man, will I fill your boxes. Benny saw the female smile, a yellowed, jagged-toothed grin, and he knew she understood. Not much later, Benny clawed his way out of the ground through a narrow hole in the earth the female ghoul had created with a thrust from her bone staff. Flopping around in the cemetery grass, he took a deep breath of air, the cold night invigorating every muscle in his body. He rolled over and looked at his wound. It still didn't hurt. He'd almost forgotten about it. The tears in the flesh seemed only scratches now. And beneath, he could feel his muscles pulse with energy he'd never felt before. There was a tingle on his scalp, and he ran his fingers through his hair. Thick, black strands fell away. He looked at the clumps in his hands, sighing. Small price to pay, he said, with a grin. Benny took a deep breath, then jumped to his feet with simian grace. He felt strong, very hungry, and ready to make good on a promise. He didn't know what he was becoming, but he did know that Chow would be the first to find out. This is Jason Hill. Thank you for listening to The Boxborn Wraith by Kevin David Anderson. Many of Kevin David Anderson's short stories have appeared in podcasts like Pseudopod, The Drabblecast, and The Dunsteve. Anderson's novel Night of the Living Trekkies from Quirk Books earned positive reviews in the LA Times, The Washington Post, Fangoria, and received a starred review in Publishers Weekly. Anderson is an active member of the HWA Horror Writers Association with a BA in Mass Communication and 15 years of award-winning marketing experience. For more on him, go to www.kevindavidanderson.com. Thanks for joining me this week. See you next time.
And remember, when you lie alone in the dark, unable to close your eyes, just keep telling yourself, it's only a story.